Oh, yeah.
I don't know who he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Here you go.
He was looking at it and said that.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Samaria Herbert, and I'm a programs coordinator with the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. I just want to thank everyone. I'm a little tall, so I'm trying to figure out the configurations. Okay. I'd just like to start by thanking everyone for coming out tonight. It's awesome seeing all these faces here, especially with the pandemic and everything else that we've been going through. We really appreciate the support. So I'll be going ahead to do the introduction for Dr. Dimsdale. And we're looking forward to an awesome program tonight. We will be having a little bit of a Q&A session towards the end, so we'll let you know when we're ready for those questions, and we'll go from there. All right. Dr. Dimsdale attended Charlton College and then Stanford University, where he obtained an MA in sociology and an MD degree. He obtained psychiatric training at MGH and was on the faculty of Harvard Medical School from 1976 to 1985, when he moved to the University of California, San Diego, where he is now Regent Edward A. Dixon Emeritus Professor and Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry Emeritus. His clinical subspecialty is consultation psychiatry. He is a former career awardee of the American Heart Association and is past president of the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research, the American Psychosomatic Society, and the Society of Behavioral Medicine. He is editor-in-chief emeritus of Psychosomatic Medicine and is a previous guest editor of Circulation and former editor-at-large of Journal Psychosomatic Research. He has been a consultant to the President's Commission on Mental Health, the Institute of Medicine, the National Academies of Science, the Department of Justice, NASA, and NIH was the advisor to the UC Regents Health Sciences Committee. He was a member of the DSM-5 task force and chaired the work group studying somatic symptom disorders. His research interests include stress physiology, ethnicity, and sleep. He is the author of over 500 publications, including Anatomy of Malice, The Enigma of the Nazi War Criminals, Yale University Press, 2016, and Dark Persuasion, The History of Brainwashing from Pavlov to Social Media. Without further ado, Dr. Dimsdale.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming tonight. It's such a pleasure to see people as opposed to a Zoom screen. Zoom has been wonderful, but the opportunity to see people is just grand. I originally was going to do a PowerPoint presentation, but we had some glitches, and I'm just as happy not doing the PowerPoint. So what I'll do is I'll speak a little bit with some notes and a lot just trying to look at you and figure out what you're interested in and what your questions are. And then we'll have some back and forth subsequently. You know, when I tell people I'm interested in brainwashing, the typical response is, Joel, why would you be interested? This is musty, old Cold War stuff with bad science and morally challenged scientists. There is that about brainwashing, but that's also not true. It's not just moldy, musty, Cold War material at all. If anything, it has its origins really over a century ago, at the time of the Russian Revolution and Ivan Pavlov, and it continues to evolve even today. As to the bit about bad scientists, well, there were plenty of bad scientists, but there were also some Nobel laureates who were involved in the research. And as to the bit about morally challenged scientists, you betcha. There were some saints and some sinners. And I think the interesting thing to me is this intersection of the person, their development, and the vast social trends that are going on that turn out to make the story of brainwashing really interesting. But I'll tell you, I probably wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have gotten interested in this, except for my neighbors. My neighbors had themselves castrated and then undertook a mass suicide. When this happens long ago and far away, it's one thing. But when it happens in your own backyard, it really demands attention. As I said, the origins of scientific brainwashing really date back to the time of the Russian Revolution. Curiously, Ivan Pavlov, the one we hear about all the time, was a Nobel laureate. His dog labs were in the basement of a physiology building across from the Neva River in St. Petersburg. The river flooded one day, and it was a 100-year flood. It was a very large flood. And the dog labs were flooded. It was evening, there was nobody around, and the flooding rose and rose so that the dogs in the crates were floating, and the water rose higher till the dogs were just, with their little muzzles, barely snuffling air. And at that point, an animal handler was able to come in and rescue them. But before he could do that, he had to take each dog, dunk the dog out under the crate, and get them out. And the dogs were never the same. They forgot everything that they had been trained to learn. Their dispositions changed as well. Dogs that were heretofore submissive became aggressive, and vice versa. They changed who they liked amongst the dog handlers. In other words, the dogs had an almost total personality transplant. Now, unless you're a dog owner, you'd say, well, Joel, what do you mean a personality? Well, if you're a dog owner, you know that dogs do have dispositions, different dispositions. But the thing that was most striking was that they had lost their memory. If this had happened to anyone else, we would never have known about it. But this happened to Ivan Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov was a consummate behavioral trainer. He could train a dog to respond to the note C, but not C sharp. That's precision. Pavlov, for the rest of his life, was struck by the fact that trauma changes people, that it disrupts memories, that it disrupts behaviors. I suppose the next chapter in the brainwashing story came when Lenin visited Pavlov. And it wasn't just a photo op. Lenin came and stayed for 2 hours, talking with Pavlov, really commiserating with Pavlov, saying, how are we going to be able to reshape the Soviet man? How are we going to be able to get beyond all the years of Tsarist repression? How can we reshape people? And Pavlov cautiously said, well, behavior can be modified. Whereupon Lenin came back and said, do you mean you can help me train the new Soviet man and make him, Lenin didn't talk about her, make the Soviet man a good communist? And Pavlov said, yes, I can help you with that. Now, if you recall your history, the early days of the Soviet Union were accompanied by famine. The economic policies didn't work, the weather didn't work, the country was bankrupt. Despite this, Lenin and subsequently Stalin funded Pavlov to the tune of buying him 357 assistants. Think about that. 357 research assistants and postdocs. That would be a huge lab today in America, where we have resources. At the time, in the Soviet Union, this was absolutely unheard of. When Lenin died and Stalin took over, as you know, Stalin distrusted everyone and purged anyone who was close to him. Matter of fact, more senior military were killed by Stalin than were killed in World War II by Hitler. But Stalin never turned on Pavlov, continued to support Pavlov. Stalin liked Pavlov because he was a materialist. And, the communists didn't believe in religion, didn't believe that people were any different from any other animals, so that aspect of Pavlov was appealing to the communists. But secondly, oddly enough, Pavlov believed that learned behavior could be inherited. This fit right in with Stalin's goal of changing the people of the Soviet Union. Really, since the days of the show trials, there's been an assumption that Pavlov's approach somehow informed Stalin in the interrogations that accompanied the show trials. Recall that people made outlandish confessions, unbelievable confessions. And people really suspected this was some shenanigans from Pavlov. So I'm going to pause here for a moment and ask a couple questions for you to be thinking of. In these examples that I'm talking about, is this brainwashing? And if it is, what makes you say that? Because brainwashing is a flamboyant, peculiar term that really didn't get born until 1950. And I'm talking back around 1914, 1930, in that time framework. But the problem with brainwashing is one of definition. How is brainwashing different from indoctrination? How is it different from conversion? How is it different from intimidation? Obviously, there's some degree of overlap in these things, but brainwashing really means that there was coercive persuasion, that there was a degree of force, sometimes attended by a surreptitious quality. And I think it's useful. We sometimes use this term brainwashing in a loose sort of way. I don't know whether you've ever caught yourself saying about somebody you disagree with, oh, he's an idiot. Whatever your political beliefs are, we all think that all the time, even though he or she may not be an idiot, but may just disagree with you. In brainwashing, there was a tendency, and there still is a tendency, to say that the person who's being brainwashed must have been weak, and that doesn't ring true because the circumstances where these people have been treated, they are basically in extremis, frequently in a life-threatening situation. So, brainwashing turned a new direction with World War II. At that time, everybody was racing for a drug for truth serum, a drug that could extract the truth from the enemy. All sides were working on this. The Nazis were studying concentration camp survivors in Dachau with mescaline. This is in the early 1940s. They experimented with it and concluded that while it could make the inmates more garrulous, it didn't really elicit any useful information. We set up via the OSS a large think tank looking at truth drugs, and we focused on marijuana. None of these drugs panned out particularly. We could give sedating drugs to make people relaxed. We could give stimulating drugs to jazz people up. We could give hallucinogens to have people have weird experiences. But right here in Texas, in Ferris, Texas, was an obstetrician in 1920 doing a home delivery with morphine and scopolamine. This was a recipe called Dämmerschlaf. German means twilight sleep. It was one of the early recipes for having a painless childbirth. So the doctor finished the delivery, healthy full-term baby, and was looking around for some scales in the kitchen to weigh the child. And he asked the father, where are the scales? And the father didn't know. He says, you don't have scales? And at that point, the young mother, still gorked out asleep on the kitchen table, says, they're on a nail behind the picture on the kitchen door. With this, the doctor became absolutely convinced that these drugs compel the truth. It was a single trial. It was a kind of a generous extrapolation on the basis of a case of one, but he was a very persuasive advocate, and he traveled the length of the state, consulting on every side. He was convinced back then that at least a third of the people in jail were incorrectly in jail. I'm not sure that that's changed, but that was his conviction. And he was going to prove whether somebody was guilty or innocent. I have a slide here which you can look at in your imagination. This was a very popular theme all across the world, and there's an engraving from a Spanish textbook in forensic psychiatry of about 100 years ago. It's actually in my book, and it shows the doctor working in the jail with the sheriff on one side and the criminal on the bed. So people were trying really hard to work out these drugs. And then the question was, well, how do you prove this in a court? Well, they needed academics. So that's when the academics started getting involved with this question about brainwashing. How do you test this? How do you test a laboratory model of brainwashing? They did all kinds of things. They went out to the jails. They found axe murderers in Alabama. Strange people all over who they were trying to convict or else exonerate. But the question was, would it stand up? So if I brought you in to my laboratory and told you to try to keep a secret, and you were my associate and you tried to extract the secret from her, would you be able to? And then how would you model that? After all, this is a laboratory. It's not as if you're a soldier and you know when the Normandy invasion is going to occur. So these experimental design questions were really big and involved a lot of people. All of this subsided when World War II ended. And there was a sigh of relief throughout the world that there was peace. But as you know, it was a brief sigh. And when the Cold War began, that's when brainwashing really began. The clearest manifestations occurred in Korea. And the term brainwashing was developed by a retired OSS propaganda officer who took a Chinese term, xinao, which actually means something on the order of a retreat to think and refresh the heart. And he translated that brainwashing. And by the time he was done, and by the time the Manchurian Candidate came around, we have this fearsome black magic term that doesn't have any logical meaning. We're stuck with it. The people who were studying it then much preferred the term coercive persuasion, because we have an intuitive sense for what that might mean. But what does brainwashing mean? I did a Google search, and I counted the web pages. The number of web pages with brainwashing is 38 million. And then I did a count on coercive persuasion. Anyone want to guess? There's no reason for any of you to know this. It's not a quiz.
38.
48,000 versus 38 million. So, to all intents and purposes, brainwashing as a term has won out, even though the term coercive persuasion is a much crisper term. The problem was that the Korean War, as one of the conditions of the armistice, was that we would give the POWs their choice of where they wanted to be repatriated. We assumed, rightfully, that many of the Chinese and North Korean POWs would not want to go back and would instead want to settle in the West or else in nationalist China or Taiwan. We were absolutely flummoxed when 21 of our soldiers decided that they didn't want to come home. And they wanted to settle in China or Russia. There were horrible recriminations, soul searching. What did this mean? You know, from a viewpoint of quality assurance, whether you're in medicine or industry, if you have a phenomenon that disturbs you, you try not to get angry. You try to say, okay, well, how often is this happening? Why is it happening? How often do we think it could happen randomly? Out of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the fact that 21 chose to defect, I'm not sure, indicates a moral crisis of the United States. But that was how it was viewed. People thought that it was evidence of momism, of liberals, of professors, etc. On the other side, the psychiatrists and psychologists who were treating the soldiers pointed out that when people are subjected to enough debility, when they're starved, sickened, when they're disabled from all of that, and when they live in constant dread, that their decision-making is impaired. Matter of fact, Charles Mayo of the Mayo Clinic testified in front of the United Nations and said, if anything, he was surprised that so many people had managed to stay human in the context of their POW experience. You know, if you're like me and you've watched MASH and loved MASH for years, you have an idea of the Korean War that has no basis in reality. The Korean War was a brutal war. And as you know, it hasn't exactly concluded. But as a result of that, the CIA chief Dulles decided to set up what has come to be known as the Manhattan Project of the Mind. Very costly, involving CIA working with universities to get academics working in this area. I'm going to go on for maybe 10 more minutes and stop, but I just wanted to set the stage on this. Anybody here a Cornell graduate? Most of the CIA money flowed through a front set up at Cornell at New York Hospital. And they sent the money all over the place. The head of this was a neurologist, Harold Wolff, who was really the dean of American neurology at the time. He was the editor of the lead neurology journal, president of the American Neurologic Society. And his associate, Larry Hinkle, who I knew, Larry was a kind of a big buccaneering cardiovascular epidemiologist who didn't take fools well. Brilliant. Both of these guys were brilliant. Larry had a wonderful, peppery sense of humor. But the two of them headed this outfit at Cornell and sent money around. Meanwhile, the CIA had its staff officers working at Cornell, and the staff officers had their own operational needs. Wolf and Hinkle thought that they were using CIA funds to do their basic research. The CIA thought that they were using Hinkle and Wolf to get their basic research needs. So one of the CIA people asked Harold Wolf, do you think we can work out a graph that shows how much pain we need to administer to a person before they panic and become manageable? And Wolf replied smoothly, I'm sure we could work that out. Regards. Wolf's personal proposal to the agency was to develop probes to ablate parts of the brain and to test ways of reversing that and reversing memory. And you know, when you read the first part of his proposal, by the way, if you think this is fun, reviewing FOIA documents from the CIA, each one a one-page TIFF that's blacked out except for prepositions. It's challenging. So when you start with Wolf's first part of his proposal, you think, well, that's a kind of a brutal animal model. I'm not sure I believe this is the right thing to do, but maybe we've learned something. And then when you read on, you realize he's not talking about animals. And he's saying that the agency is to provide the subjects, the place, and dispose of them when he's done with them. But probably one of the more notorious CIA brainwashing endeavors, and this is all over the world, and it's not just intelligence agencies. We'll get to religion if we have time, and other things. But any of you a Jason Bourne fan? Anybody? Is that it? I adore them. I adore those books and those movies. So if you remember the plot, Matt Damon is this kind of nice young soul who's unhappy with his life and goes and sees this avuncular psychiatrist who promises, there, I'll fix you. I will wipe out your memories and I'll train you to do something else. And he trains him to become Jason Bourne, the consummate assassin. All of this was true except for the bit about the consummate assassin. Just as Harold Wolf was the head of American Neurology, Ewan Cameron was head of the American Psychiatry Association. And he ran all I can say is one of the more shocking things that was ever been done in medicine. He was head of a psychiatric hospital in Montreal, and Cameron's view was that psychotherapy was inefficient. He thought, it'll just be so much easier if we start out with a blank slate. We will obliterate your memory and then teach you new ways of thinking. So how did he obliterate memory? He gave hundreds of electroconvulsive therapies, hundreds within a month. supplemented by insulin coma therapy, LSD, amphetamine, Thorazine, and anything else he could think of. And this was not A or B or C. It was the blue plate special. It was all of this. And when he was done obliterating people's memory, he put them to sleep. Pavlov was very interested in sleep. Didn't have time to go into that. He put them to sleep and put speakers in the pillow that played succinctly the summary of what he thought the crucial message was for the person to make progress in psychotherapy. Now, I should say, these were not people who were severely ill. Some of them were severely ill, some of them were anxious, some of them had postpartum depression, some, it was a mixture of peoples. He successfully obliterated their memory and then played these repetitions 250,000 times. 250,000 times on a tape loop. Ruthie, you love your husband. You are a very good mother. Jack, you need to become more assertive. Over and over and over and over. When all this was done, there was nothing to show for it. People didn't get better. The only thing that could be demonstrated was that the patients had enduring memory problems. So I said I wanted to move on just to touch on criminals and clerics, an odd combination. What governments learned from brainwashing is that a lot of the quick and dirty things didn't work. That a lot of the subtle things required time and effort. Group immersion, sensory isolation, all these sorts of things could work, but it took work to make them effective. And then we started looking at robbers and the Stockholm Syndrome. If you remember this guy breaks into the Creditbanken bank in Stockholm, herds the staff into the vault and negotiates to get his buddy out of jail and to get some money and off into the sunset. By the time all was done, the hostages were very fond of him. And when he was ultimately captured, they hugged him goodbye and said, "We'll see you again." Now, when it was first reported, people thought that was just another typical liberal Scandinavian aberration, except that we've seen it all over the world, including the United States, including Russia, all over the world. And these things are known as HOBAS, H-O-B-A-S, hostage and barricade situations. I talked about the Texas obstetrician with his sample size of one person. Let me tell you, it is so dismaying. But the database on HOBAS, or hostage and barricade situations, is about 100,000. We have a lot of information, whether it be plane hijackings, train hijackings, kidnappings. And it turns out it's not uncommon for the victim to develop a certain amount of affection for the hostage taker. And it's not uncommon, particularly for children and for people who are somewhat less sophisticated. You'll see this in some young women who've been taken, kidnapped, sexually enslaved, people who had not been very active in the world, they're more influenceable to the person who takes them. Well, let me finish by talking about cults and religion. You know, they say a cult is any religion stranger than your own, and there's obviously some problems in defining what a cult is. But I thought I would stick with Heaven's Gate. After all, this is a Houston phenomenon. These are your progeny who came to my town of San Diego. Maybe some of you don't know or remember. Just curious. Okay. So the founders were from Houston, and they had the conviction that they were space creatures who had been marooned on Earth, and that their bodies were vessels. They also believed that sex corroded the vessel and would prevent them from ever going home. They wandered throughout the United States for decades, attracting followers, losing followers, and probably nothing would have happened and we wouldn't have heard of them, except for the misfortune of the comet. Anybody miss seeing the Hale-Bopp comet? I mean, some of you were maybe too young. It was the largest comet in thousands of years, and it was totally a surprise. We weren't expecting it. I remember seeing it. I was skiing out in New Mexico in the mountain air, and in that nighttime, to see that comet so brilliant in the sky, there was a kind of an awe quality to it. Heaven's Gate became convinced that trailing the comet was their spaceship to take them to eternity in the sky. And the leader decided that the best time to leap to the spaceship was during the comet's closest approximation to Earth. And if they killed themselves at that instant, they would all transport. So they went, the day before, they all went to Marie Callender's restaurant and had the same meal. Everybody dressed the same. Everyone ate the same. Everyone showered the same. This was uniformity. They had The next day, they filmed Farewell. This was in Rancho Santa Fe. This was a very upscale park. Very expensive. Lived in this vast mansion. And they stare into the camera and they say, "I'm not sad. I'm going home. I'm thrilled to be laying off the husk of this vehicle." One after another, I have those tapes, one after another. Each of them speaks in his or her own way. And they kill themselves. 39 bodies. So, what I've tried to do has been to describe to you some of the ways brainwashing has been raised, that question in the 20th century. Some of these events might seem to work. Some of them maybe don't work. This is up for you and all of us to think through for ourselves. I guess the thing that worries me is this century, the 21st century. If there's one thing that all of us agree about, no matter what our political beliefs, and that is that we have to be a little suspicious and cautious concerning social media. If social media can be surreptitious, if algorithms steer people in certain directions, if it promotes dangerous behavior, if it slowly forecloses on the opportunity to hear other views and beliefs, you have to ask the question, is this coercive? Is this a manifestation of coercive persuasion? So, you've been very patient. Let me take a gulp of water for my tired throat, and maybe we can discuss this.
Yeah, have some water.
Okay.
I was just going to come up here so that I can take any questions and repeat them for anyone that would like to hear it a little bit louder.
How did the 39 people kill themselves?
So the question, I got that, thanks.
Yeah, well, for our people, why did the 39 people kill themselves was the first question.
I forgot that you're out there.
Yeah.
So, they took big gulps of vodka and dissolved barbiturates in some instant vanilla pudding, and when they started to feel groggy, tied a plastic bag over their heads. They lay down in their dormitories. They were covered in really purple Majesty cloaks, and that's how they were found. 39 of them.
Before we get to the next question, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Tatiana Euclid. For those that know me, I'm the program coordinator for the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. It's really nice to see those that are joining us again, and thank you all for coming. And Professor Jan.
Yeah, just how do the CIA, the Nazis, the Russians, and professors fail so miserably in brainwashing, and then Marshall Applewhite and Jim Jones and these guys convince people to kill themselves?
Yeah. So the question was, how did all of these intelligence agencies and all of these academics fail at brainwashing when some relatively unsophisticated people succeed in doing awful things, including persuading people to kill themselves? I don't think intelligence agencies have spent as much time as they needed to on charisma. Mm. I think that's a big fault. In government work, we want something that can be routinely administered, and maybe we don't have that many charismatic people around. Although some of the people were charismatic. George White, who was the guy at Cornell who asked, how much pain do we have to administer before we can get total submission? One of his colleagues said that he was so good he could charm the hide off a rabid dog. I think the intelligence agencies have been effective, but they haven't gone for these instant changes because in their hands, they were never able to do that. And it is something different with the Stockholm Syndrome, because that is fairly quick. The religious commune, I wouldn't say that the leaders of that commune were instantly able to do things. The average length of time of the people in the movement had been like 20 or 30 years, after which they had broken off contact with their family and friends. And so it was only after that continuing exposure that he was able to persuade them to kill themselves. I think the Habas situations we don't understand. And I'll tell you, the FBI is very ambivalent about this. There are, in my book, I talk about this, about some of the FBI people. You would think they were writing in my kind of journal. They were so oriented towards personality development, child development, psychopathology, and then there's the other wing of the FBI that says, cut the crap, you know. So we have a wide disagreement within the agency about whether we believe Habas is commonly encountered. I think there is consistent agreement that in life-threatening circumstances that are ongoing, more than a day or two, and with people, particularly with children, that you can make some headway as far as the brainwashing. But you ask a very good question, and we'll have to see. We'll have to see whether we get any better, or if we want us to get better with that. Charles.
Would it be relevant or accurate to say in response to the most recent question that government agencies aim for a mass population, and that some of these cults that induce members to commit suicide, that those members are more self-selected?
Would it be relevant or fair to say that governments try and go with mass populations while cults and those kinds of entities that are kind of a little bit more self-selected? Is that fair to say?
So I think cults are much more selective who they attract and how they retain. In terms of government agencies, it's interesting. We're not in that time right now. But the Cold War was as much a matter of a conflict in belief as it was a conflict of territory. We wanted people to defect. The other side wanted people to defect. These were mortal blows to the belief structure of the countries. Right now, we don't care a rat's fanny if somebody defects to us, or vice versa. But there was a concern and an interest in the government's part of trying to get large groups, but it didn't pan out. Insofar as propaganda was important, and insofar as social media is a more powerful propaganda on steroids sort of thing, then we can think about that again. Can we induce people to have so much rage and distrust that they will go out and do things that are foolish, destructive, irrational? Clearly, I think most of us would say yes. We see that. We see that all the time.
Yes.
Dr. Denzel, you mentioned the show trials that happened in the Soviet Union. I was under the impression that like physical torture was a role, or had a role in that. How does that tie in with how the defendants testified?
Yeah. So during the show trials in the Soviet Union, what was your name?
No.
Yeah. Morgan was under the impression that more physical, I guess, it was more physical coercion versus mental coercion from what the testifiers had said. Can you touch a little bit on that?
You're absolutely right. And so, if you recall what I was saying about the events in Korea, what the experts were pointing out was if you take somebody, you starve him to death, you sleep deprive him, you constantly threaten him with execution, you then play propaganda broadcasts 24 hours every day, you arrange so it's slightly less hostile if the person collaborates. Under those circumstances, you can get some mileage. So if you think that brainwashing is some black magic, it's not. It's commonly associated with a great deal of coercion. Matter of fact, in the confessions during Stalin's time, many of the confessions, we only have these now from the archives, many of the confessions are blood-stained.
Confessions of what?
Blood-stained.
Are blood-stained. So, yes, people confessed to unlikely, outlandish things, but they were confused, in pain, exhausted, anxious, all of the above. And in that setting, they confessed. Was their confession genuine? Some of them gave these very emotional farewells. Farewell, my country. I love you, and I realize that I've fallen off the path and deserve to die. Many of them, those confessions, go like that. Some of them knew that if they didn't confess, their families would be killed. So is this persuasion or not? You may, some of you may remember Cardinal Mindszenty from Hungary in 1948-ish, was locked up. Mindszenty was an old-time Catholic cardinal who opposed anybody, left or right, who tried to put the moves on the church. So he'd been in jail. Everybody hated him politically. And ultimately, the communists took him. He lost half his body weight in prison. He was drugged. He made these confessions and said, I tried to steal the crown jewels of Hungary. And, what he said was that the thing that got to him more than anything else was the solitude, the stillness. Now, he had everything done to him, but what he said was the stillness was what got to him the most.
This is going to be the last question, by the way, just a heads up.
You adjudicate.
Well,
I've got 3 questions.
I'm willing to be the next to last if you like.
Well, if it's okay with Dr. Dimsdale, we're going to stay a little bit afterwards if you want to come up and ask your questions. It's just for the sake of timing, we're going to do one more question from the audience, and then after the fact. You want to go ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Go ahead.
Thank you. And this sort of trying to tie all this together. And I hate to ask this as the last or even next to last question because it opens a bag of worms. I want to be apolitical. How do you explain the entire pandemic situation and the perception of, and let me say, I have a bias only to the extent that I'm a physician. Otherwise, I have no political bias. How the question was asked about the mass audience as opposed to a small secular small group with cults. We have a situation in which almost half the United States population has shunned masks, shunned vaccination, immunization. Same people who willingly recognize the benefit of the Salk vaccine for polio, for the benefit of eradication of smallpox. And then there are some very unscientific suggestions for gargling or drinking antiseptics or radical things. And you talk about suicide, it's apparent when you have 39 people waiting for the mothership. That's tiny. That's tiny. What about the fact that we see refrigeration trucks lined up outside of hospitals because the morgues are so full, and that people have willingly, knowingly declined to abide by a simple wearing a 99-cent mask or the other efforts? When the message is coming from above, from a very powerful voice, but it's only one voice that is led a lot of people to believe that they should take actions which are not scientifically proven, shun those, even when a vaccine became available, which we all waited for, have declined to take it for a variety of reasons, both left and right. But it seems that to me, that is the gorilla in the room, or the elephant in the room, is that it far outweighs any individual Jonestown or anything like that. We have people who have willingly sacrificed their lives in belief to be in lockstep with ideology.
So, do you want to succinctly summarize that?
Repeat it if you like.
How does it compare what's going on in 2020 with the pandemic? How does that compare with other, I guess you could say, smaller acts of harm done to a smaller group of people? I don't know if that's succinctly, but...
I can't answer that succinctly, but let me try to just throw out a couple things. Number one, I wrote the book to talk about the 20th century because I feel that I needed a little bit of distance to be dispassionate and to be able to access enough information. I am not dispassionate today. That said, so you believe that people are interested in the truth and that the truth will set them free. A lot of people are not interested in the truth. I guess when the vaccines came out, we all cheered. We thought the battle had been won. It was maybe one battle, but in no way was the war won, because we totally ignored the public health messaging, the information, and that is as complex as mRNA vaccine. It's very complex, and we didn't do a terrific job at it. So I think what we confront also, I wouldn't call it brainwashing, because I keep harping on this idea that brainwashing has to have coercion in it. But is it propaganda? And why are people spreading propaganda? That's another question. Is it fear on people's part? You know, there are these delightful old cartoons from the days of the smallpox vaccination. You've probably seen them because people were quite afraid of the smallpox vaccination and convinced that they were going to grow cows out of the vaccine site. So, you know, there are all these incredible etchings that show people at a party and a cow's head is growing here and a hoof is growing there. So I think there's been fear about vaccination. I think there was fear, not as much, in the time of polio. I think that was more accepted, but there was still fear there. There is the paradox is that there's a British nurse who is convinced that anybody who has supported vaccination is a war criminal, and she's collecting names to take to The Hague. So a lot of people have very strong beliefs, and their share of reality may be different. But there was one last question.
My question is, would you think that the biggest beneficiary of using the brain washing technique are the terrorist organizations which use social media, electronic media, and print media?
So do you want to?
Yeah, do we think that the biggest beneficiaries of, or do you, Dr. Dimsel, think the biggest beneficiaries of the brainwashing techniques are those terrorist organizations or extremist organizations that use social media to recruit and to, I guess, spread message?
So we are all concerned about that. I think the broader question is, how can social media be weaponized to serve such people? There was a RAND study that talks about the fire hose of disinformation that's administered via social media. And the RAND study sadly concludes, don't expect the squirt gun of truth to counter a fire hose of misinformation. So I think it's very much incumbent upon us as a culture to think through how are we comfortable regulating social media. Right now it's a social intoxicant, and no culture deals well with a new social intoxicant. We've been driving cars for over 100 years, and we still don't have the drinking and driving thing solved. It takes a while, and in our culture, it's going to take even longer than it would in England, for instance. So I realize I didn't address head-on, but I think I addressed the gist of what you were saying. So I'll be happy to stick around if there are any questions. And thank you so much for turning out. It's wonderful to see you and to know that you also are interested and concerned and worried about this area. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much for coming out. Just as a heads up, we are going to have another event in the West Side featuring Eric Botts, the Director of Global Cybersecurity from the University of St. Thomas. He's going to be talking about geopolitics and how that has changed in the era of cybersecurity. You can definitely check out our website, wachhouston.org, to find information on that, probably within the next week or so. Once again, thank you guys so much for coming out. My name is Tatiana Euclid. I am a program coordinator with the World Affairs Council. And we'll definitely send you guys all the video. And if you haven't gotten a book, please come see us, and we'll be sure to get your information so we can get that for you whenever we get more of those ordered. Thank you guys again.